Hello everyone. Welcome to NCSL's webinar entitled Planning and Scoping Evaluations. My name is Kiernan McGordy and I will be moderating the webinar today. I'm a Principal Evaluator with the North Carolina Program Evaluation Division. I have with me today as speakers Craig Timmons, who is a Senior Management Analyst with the Georgia Department of Audits and Accounts Performance Audit Division. Emily Johnson is a Senior Policy Analyst with the Texas Sunset Advisory Commission. And Justin Landau is a Principal Audit Supervisor with Michigan's Office of the Auditor General. I'd like to thank the National Legislative Program Evaluation Society and NCSL for sponsoring this webinar. NLPES is the NCSL Staff Association for legislative staff involved in program evaluation or performance auditing. One of its key purposes is promoting professional development opportunities like this webinar for legislative staff. I serve as the chair of the NLPES Professional Development Subcommittee, so I'm particularly pleased that we could bring this program to you today. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be available on NCSL's website within the week. This webinar is a platform for information exchange and engagement. Over the next 60 minutes, we encourage participation through our chat box, so feel free to type your questions and answer any questions in the chat box, which is in the lower left hand of your screen. To begin building some comfortability with the chat function and to also learn who is on the line today, I invite you to type in the state from which you are calling now. Okay, I see Michigan figured it out, so that's good. Okay, I also want to briefly mention the resources. Above the presentation, you will see a couple tabs with one of them labeled Resources. Here you can find and download a PDF version of the PowerPoint, as well as some other handouts the speakers will be referring to today. You can access this tab at any time during the presentation. For access to all URLs within the presentation, I welcome you to access and download the PDF where you can easily visit the links we've included. Our first speaker up today is Emily from Sunset.
Thank you, Kiernan. So I'm going to spend just a little bit of time today talking with y'all about the scoping process the Sunset Commission staff uses to make our projects more manageable. So I just want to spend a very brief few minutes talking a little bit about Sunset, just to give you some background for those of you that may not be familiar with the Sunset process in Texas. So the idea behind Sunset is that agencies shouldn't be continued into perpetuity. So most agencies have a date in law that triggers their expiration unless the legislature continues them. In Texas, about 130 agencies are subject to Sunset review, including most executive branch agencies, as well as some special purpose entities that the legislature chooses to make subject to our review. Universities and courts are exempt from Sunset, however. But the Sunset process isn't your typical audit or evaluation. We don't get assigned specific programs or functions to look at, and instead we get assigned entire state agencies to evaluate. The legislature sets the Sunset schedule in law, so each agency is typically reviewed about every 12 years or so. We usually review 20 to 25 entities each cycle, and for that, a cycle for us is a 2-year period since Texas has a biennial legislative session. So what that means is that we look at 20 to 25 entities across a roughly 18-month period before each legislative session. So we cram quite a bit of work into a small amount of time. Obviously, the one thing that we have to address for most agencies is whether the agency should continue. But beyond continuation, our scope is pretty open. And because we're looking at the entire agency and we have this limited amount of time to complete the work, we can't address every problem that we find. And in all honesty, we may not even have time to find every problem. So that's why scoping is so important for our work. So I just wanted to provide a little bit of comic relief for you all. I'll let y'all kind of run through this. But basically, I was thinking about how we do our work, and I thought, oh my gosh, at first, this is exactly what I feel like. We get this agency that we have to look at, and it just seems so incredible, and how are we ever going to get through it? And so we try to hurl ourselves through it, or we sort of tap dance around it. And basically, what we have found that if without some structure to help you figure out how to get through it, the project can really be, you can be wasting a lot of time before you get to that end result where you figure out that the project is you and you are the project and you are one with it. Okay, in all seriousness though, to give you some context for what scoping means in the context of our process, what you see on your screen is a high-level graphical representation of our work. And so at the top of that funnel, you see all of the inputs that we have to help figure out what we're going to focus on. But Sunset is not a yellow book or a red book state like some of your offices. Instead, the standards that guide our reviews come from several sources. That includes our statutory criteria that's outlined in our Texas Sunset Act, a handful of sort of good government provisions that we apply to most agencies we are looking at. We look at industry-specific best practices that vary by subject matter, and we'll do comparative analysis with other states. And then we have a handful of what we call model standards. And these are criteria that we have compiled after evaluating similar functions over and over again. So this is things like licensing standards, contracting standards, grants, how agencies interact with nonprofit organizations, those types of things. But there's never a one-size-fits-all or a sort of checklist approach. Our reviews are all very unique, and each one is very different. And so to figure out how we're going to get through the process and figure out what to focus on, we build in checkpoints at key places in the review, and that's what this funnel is depicting. The scoping process, which is where I'm going to spend most of my time in a few minutes, comes after our initial research, after we have taken in agencies, meetings with the agency, meetings with stakeholders, and just some initial background information. We're going to spend some time scoping. And then after that, one of our first key check-ins is what we call an issue list meeting, and you'll see that down on the funnel. And that's where we're meeting with senior staff to help narrow our focus and make sure that the team has buy-in for the direction that they want to go, that we have clearly identified problems, and that we have information or can get information to help prove those problems. And then we will have a second check-in phase, what we call our issue plan meeting, and that's a second meeting with our senior staff to discuss potential recommendations. We've moved beyond identifying the problems, and now we're trying to fix those problems. And then the final phase of our process is the writing and editing that you see there before we get to production of the staff report. Okay, so to talk about our risk assessment, one of the key tools we use is the risk assessment tool that you see there on your screen, and that's also available in the resources tab that Kiernan mentioned. I would love to tell you that this is a very fancy, very high-tech tool, but really it's a qualitative tool that's a series of questions designed to help the team identify which programs or areas of an agency represent the most significant risks. And so what happens is our teams will meet in a brainstorm, in a sort of facilitated brainstorm discussion, and go through 4 steps. The first thing they're going to do is identify those key risk categories, and those are exactly what you would suspect. We're going to look at which programs and activities have the biggest budget, have the most employees, which ones may have had problems in the past, either through audit or maybe there's been a lot of media coverage about a scandal, maybe there were significant legislative changes. Those are all areas that would be identified as higher risk. And so once we go through that as the team, hopefully we're all on the same page, and then we'll sort of step back and have a conversation about anything we may have left out. We call these sleeper areas. What didn't make the list, and why didn't it make the list, and should it make the list? And then we will move on to a discussion about whether or not what the list we've identified can actually be tackled within our existing resources. In all honesty, the answer to that question is usually no, because we've usually identified a laundry list of problems or potential risk areas. But we have, again, this limited amount of time, and so we have to really figure out how to prioritize those. And so then we'll think about what information we may need to help further evaluate those risk areas that we have identified. What data might we need from the agency? What additional meetings might we need to have? And so on. Now, for smaller agencies, this discussion may result in just a simple whiteboard brainstorm, very informal outcome or work product. But for larger, more complex agencies, we have to scope pretty aggressively. And so to talk a little bit about the work product you might see, again, it's going to vary depending on the team and depending on the review. But the overall goal, again, is to categorize those risk areas to help organize our efforts. And so for a larger agency where it's more complicated, what I've provided is just an example, a very high-level example of a much bigger spreadsheet that we might create for a larger agency, and it would look something like what you see on your screen. Can't really provide full work products here in this format, but so we would take the agency and the programs and activities that they conduct, and we would organize them by various risk categories. Again, things like public impact to the public, which programs have the highest impact to the public, which have the most budget, and we would categorize those and prioritize those. Now, again, this is a qualitative assessment, and so while one program or activity may be categorized as higher risk than another due to some quantitative measure like the budget or the number of contracts, for example, there could be other reasons it becomes a lower priority that don't necessarily show up in those hard numbers. And so you're probably asking, how do we decide ultimately what to pursue? For Sunset, we've got two things that really drive that. Most importantly, we want to make sure that we address real problems, not theoretical problems. So if we have identified risk areas that could be a problem, but after we dig deeper, it's like, well, that's only a problem in theory and we haven't seen real issues with it, then that may not be something that we choose to pursue. Also, we try to group our issues and problems into clear themes. So if we identify a problem, but it's counter or not in sync with the rest of the things that we have identified, we may not address it. And so how do we use this brainstorm and work product that I've been talking about? Ultimately, regardless of what the work product looks like, whether it's just a very informal brainstorm or a more formal, structured Excel spreadsheet that comes out of the discussion, it becomes part of a document that we will put together for those issue meetings that I mentioned at the beginning when we were talking about that funnel, because we want to summarize the team's discussion for our senior staff. And so what you see here is an example of what that might look like. Again, I've modified this so I don't give away real information, but you can see kind of a high-level example of what would happen. So we would put together a document that provides a context for the review and the team's overall impressions. And so we might say whether or not the agency is generally well run, or no, in fact, they're complete disarray and everything is terrible, or there might be a discussion about any political hot button issues. And then what would follow is that those potential issue areas that we have identified. And so you can see for a small agency, this was our board's podiatric medical examiners. And so it's a small entity, and so you see kind of three areas there. We were talking about, again, continuation, since that's what we must address, and then a licensing section and an enforcement section. And within that, you can see more targeted areas that we would be looking to potentially fix. And again, this isn't necessarily the end product, but is how we get to what we ultimately are going to write about. Now, in a larger agency, this document may also include any issues or programs the team is not planning to pursue, what we say have been scoped out. And if you have an extremely large agency, again, you have to agree that there's going to be things that you just simply can't look at, but that's the whole point of the scoping process, to identify areas that are low risk or that the team doesn't have the resources and capabilities to tackle in the given period of time. And so that would show up on this document as well. And so to wrap up, again, the end goal. What's the end goal? We want to manage the product and manage the project and manage it effectively. And so scoping helps us decide, again, where we're going to dig deeper. It helps us develop those clear themes that will tie the whole report together. Helps us allocate our workload among the team members. Obviously, our more senior staff are going to work on our more complex issues that we've identified. And then again, the goal is to focus on real problems. We want to solve the real problems, not just the symptoms, so that we have the biggest impact both on the agency's operations and on the public or the entities that the agency is regulating or affecting. So I look forward to the discussion and any questions you may have at the end, but I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Justin.
Hello, everyone. This is Justin Londo with the Michigan Office of the Auditor General, here to talk to you about how we scope out audits up here in Michigan. We developed a referent group meeting process a few years ago, and it's a process that we go through that it really helps us plan our audit objectives, our scope, our audit methodologies for all of our audits. The referent group meeting process is a brainstorming process, a brainstorming meeting, and you usually hold it roughly 4 to 6 weeks into an audit. Hopefully when your preliminary survey is kind of coming to an end. Depending on the size of the entity that you're looking at, it could be a little longer or it could be much sooner. So the meeting attendees, you would have your audit team, and up here in Michigan, we have an audit manager over that audit team. We have an audit division administrator who would also attend. But what's really cool is that we're able to have the Auditor General attend, the Deputy Auditor General, our State Relations Officer, who is our liaison between our office and our legislature, and we also have our Chief Investigator attend. So I just feel that it's really cool to have all the key people in our office to be all on the same page, and it truly is a meeting of the minds. During the referent group meeting, we provide everyone a brief background on what we're looking at regarding the subject matter of the audit. It could include items such as, are there any activities that we found that are susceptible to fraud, waste, abuse, or mismanagement? Are there significant or large dollar amount activities going through this entity that we are looking at, and did we look at the controls or processes with that during our preliminary survey? Other things that may be, we might have identified a high-risk area that is happening, so we can discuss that too. Are there any areas limited, or maybe there's limited or no oversight within certain areas that we're looking at? These are all things that we would discuss during this meeting. And another thing we might do is find out, have we reviewed or audited this entity recently? Are there any prior audit findings? Have there been any other audits completed by the feds or internal audit for the state of Michigan? Those kinds of things. And then we would also discuss during this meeting, perhaps management, when we interviewed management, that maybe they're telling us certain areas within their operations that they feel, could have some issues. So we might talk about that during this meeting. But it's a very informal meeting. It sounds all formal, but it's just a great tool that we use to really get everybody on the same page, moving in the same direction, not too far into an audit. So we're able to meet, like I said, 4 to 6 weeks into an audit. We also talk about whether we should proceed with an audit. Sometimes we may have certain factors that we identify that causes us not to proceed and to do a full audit. Things such as maybe there's no indication of potential reportable or material conditions, no indication of potential cost savings, loss or liability to the state or public significant enough to justify the cost of continuing the audit. Maybe there's no indication of noncompliance with laws or contracts, no indication of risk to public safety. So our audit risk, the risk of negative public exposure for our office, is minimal to non-existent. So those are some factors that we may consider when determining whether to continue with an audit. But most likely we're going to continue with it, and that's how it generally is. So we'll go through and we'll discuss our planned audit objectives, our scope, our proposed scope, and our audit methodologies to complete those audit objectives, and most importantly, our estimated time for completion. And I always say to people that the entire audit team should be involved with this meeting, the meeting preparation, the discussion at the meeting. It's our time to shine. I always say it's kind of like being on the TV show Shark Tank. It's your turn to kind of sell what you've been doing for the last month to 2 months. And again, at the end, it's great because everyone from the Auditor General on down are all on the same page with our planned audit objectives, our scope, our methodologies. And so what we do, we use two primary tools for this referent group meeting, and I attached both of them to this webinar. Just want to quickly kind of go through each one of them. The first one is the referent group meeting guidance document, and you're looking at it. One of the first questions you'll see at the top of it is, recommend that the audit project proceed, yes or no. And so as we discussed earlier about these factors that you might have identified, you'd simply put yes or no on there. Like I said, most of the time we do continue with our audits. You'd have a brief program description of what you're looking at, specific factors identified when selecting the audit. Was it based on something recent in the media? Was it based on a legislative mandate? Has it been a long time since we've been there? That kind of stuff. Those certain factors of why did we choose this entity to audit. And then the next one talks about a preliminary scope or any objectives that we shared with the agency. Usually at this time, when you're 4 to 6 weeks into an audit, you're basically just scoping things out. You're meeting with various areas within the entity to find out what their processes are, what they're doing, what their main functions are. So at this point, there's really no objectives yet to be shared with the agency. That would usually come as a result of this referent group meeting that we have. The next one is any concerns or problems encountered during the preliminary review phase. And you'll see that it says see referent group matrix. That's the other tool that we use, and I'll go through that too. These two tools together work together. Again, it's a great way to document where we've been and where we're going to be going with our audits. Number 5 talks about any other prior audits that may impact our activity. Proposed audit objectives. What do you plan to accomplish with this audit? And again, this is just it's a brainstorming session, so you don't have to know all your answers yet either. But where do you think, as of right now, you're going to want to be looking at? What are your objectives? What are your proposed audit objectives? And you want to add in what your proposed methodology would be to accomplish those objectives. Proposed audit period. We generally go back a couple of years, but it could be more, it could be less. Any impact of IT systems that may affect your proposed audit objectives, and whether you're going to review those IT systems. We have a great area within our office of IT auditors who, if you need to bring in their expertise, you can bring them in and they'll help you out too. So number 11 talks about our plans to assess the data reliability of any data that we end up using during our audit. Do you want to list those? Lastly, well, not quite lastly, but any confidential information that you're going to receive, how are we going to store it? How are we going to dispose of it? Any legislative interests or concerns? Have we seen any potential or occurrence for fraud? That's where our chief investigator, having him at this meeting, is really good because he's a fraud expert. We can talk to him about stuff that we might have seen and any actions that we intend to take to address this fraud. And then budget and staffing. How long do you expect the remaining number of hours to take with the current staff you have? Those are all important things to do for the planning process. Quickly, I want to go over to the matrix. The matrix talks about what objectives your audit's going to have. We have on the matrix template that I shown you guys. We have objectives 1, 2, 3, and then there's X, X, X. And I can't remember an audit ever being more than just a few objectives. But if you have one, we have the space here for you. But you want to answer certain questions, primary questions. This objective will answer. Any preliminary testing that you did during your preliminary survey that may help you decide whether to continue with that or not. A key thing would be criteria. Why are you testing this? What is the requirements behind it? known findings. So based on your preliminary survey, are there any known issues that you've already communicated with the agency saying, hey, we've tested, 40 of these items and we found these issues with it. Potential findings, where, at this point, maybe we're not completely done yet, so we have to do some more testing to find out if there really is any issues out there. Proposed audit methodology, how we're going to do this. And then your estimated audit hours by objective, by question within each objective. So it's kind of a nice little summary that everyone can look at, and it's a living document. We can go and we can adjust this, and it's kind of our guidance, our tool that we use. And I encourage anyone out there who wants to use these, feel free to, modify them or whatever. And if you have any questions at all, feel free to get a hold of me. I'll be more than happy to talk to you about it. And with that, I'm going to move it on to our final speaker, Craig Timmons.
Okay, thank you, Justin. Hello, everyone. Thanks for taking the time with us today. I just want to give a quick introduction to the topic that I'm going to talk you through today. When we originally met as a group, we were brainstorming those items. Excuse me 1 second. I'm having a little trouble with this slideshow. 1 second. Guys, are we, there we go. Just a little bit of a delay. Sorry for that. So when we first began brainstorming this webinar, it occurred to us, certainly occurred to me, that maybe we could, instead of going through 3 states apparatus in detail, maybe deliver 2 states and then step back a little bit and talk in more general terms about some of the common areas in scoping and planning for evaluations and audits that are potential booby traps, places where you can get hung up, get off target, misalign resources, that type of thing. And quite frankly, I'm heartened by the fact that prior to a few days ago, my fellow presenters and I, we were sort of working in isolation. And a lot of the themes that both Emily and Justin put out there and a lot of the tools are echoed in this final presentation. So that suggests that we have, even though our offices are all different, we have a lot more in common than we do that distinguishes us sometimes in the tools and the thinking that we're doing. So hopefully some of these general practices will be applicable. Okay. Pardon me, guys. I'm having a little bit of IT trouble. My slide presentation is not flowing quite the way. There it is. Okay, bear with me. So the topic today I've entitled Risk and Remedies in Planning and Scoping. As I mentioned, general planning problem areas and some hope to share with you some of those fixes. Big topic with a little time, so we'll get moving. I think we'll get moving. Again, pardon, guys. Yep. I don't know the delay, what the reason for is with the delay, but bear with me, we'll get through it. So the goals today that I've got are to share with you some professional resources. I've gained a reputation, I think, in this office of being the book hoarder and the white paper hoarder. And so in addition to some of those specific office-specific instruments and policies, procedures that have been mentioned already, I'll share with you some technical guides that I've found useful that you can acquire on your own. Give you some ideas about the products of planning and scoping as I see them, and I think have been echoed already, and then talk a little bit through some ways that we can identify risk and mitigate those risks. Goodness. There we go. Just one second. Karen, are you seeing a delay on these slides as well?
There's a little delay, but it's moving.
Okay, cool.
Craig, if you just want to say next, I can move the slides for you.
That'd be great. Okay. So the first section here, I just want to draw your attention to 2 excellent resources that there isn't really a ton of academic writing on this topic outside of the social science and the academies. And so when you can find practitioner guides, they're usually worth going after. So one that we have acquired and we use quite frequently in our training, especially for new staff, is this one. It's entitled Performance Auditing, Measuring Inputs, Outputs, and Outcomes. It's in its 3rd edition. I think we've had each of them. You can find it there at the Institute of Internal Auditors website. It'll run you about, like I said, there $135. It's more of a textbook. It covers a lot of ground beyond just planning and scoping. So if you're interested in listening to what some experts in the field, I know 2 of the authors have worked in the city of Austin. I think they're since retired. But they used to have some really excellent instruments out there available on the site. I think they're now gone. But this is definitely a worthwhile product to think about. Covers, in addition to planning and scoping, things like technical writing and source types of analyses and report writing and graphics and that sort of thing. Next slide, please. And the second one is a freebie. It's a nice one. It's from GAO, high technical level, but excellent, and it covers explicitly the planning and scoping portions of evaluation. It's pretty heady, but it's worth having in your library. With that, you'll really have a detailed. It comes out of the Applied Research and Methods units at GAO. You'll really have a detailed assessment of ways in which you can avoid problems in designing your research project. Next slide. Okay, so as I mentioned before, one of the things I wanted to do is to identify what I see as the primary planning and scoping products. And as my fellow presenters have sort of illustrated already, I think there are 2 main pieces. The first product is your entirety of the planning risk assessment, and that's going to give you the answers to what the team thinks you should be evaluating. And I think the culminating product there is something that assures for your user that you're going to have quality subjects that you're targeting and that you're justifying the opportunity cost of that project. I think Justin mentioned that as well. So there's always something either inside of a program that you could be looking at different than what you've chosen, and there's always another project to be done that you could be spending your resources toward. And so the risk assessment in totality is really designed, I think, intended to try to get you a justification for the work that you're choosing to dedicate budget and resources. The second one is sort of the tangible product that, again, those instruments from my fellow presenters illustrated well, which is the final research design. In my office, we call that our objective, scope, and methodology audit plan. And that's going to give you that technical roadmap of how you expect staff to be doing the evaluation. What are the days and weekly tasks that are going to be pursued? So in the planning process, the entirety of the planning phase, I think those are our 2 main deliverables. Next slide, please. Okay. So again, I was heartened because my fellow presenters, we had some of the same metaphors. So this is a graph chart that I give to a lot of new hires that work in our office, and I ripped this from the Austin City Auditor about 15 years ago, and I think it probably shows up in that text that I referred you guys to. And as you can see, it's graphically presenting 2 funnels. And I think the planning and the risk is there captured in that first funnel. And a lot of the specifics in the instruments and discussion that we've had thus far are all encapsulated inside of that top funnel, right? And so it's grainy. I apologize. It's been photocopied about a dozen times. That's the best version I could find. But as you can see there, the risk assessment is sort of occurring inside of this onslaught of information. I think that's a common theme that everybody's poked at. So as you can see there, you're going to be working through sets of laws, maybe some rules and regulations, budgetary and financial information, maybe some performance information, prior audits, survey of internal controls, those types of things, org charts. And I think the exercise that everybody's echoed here, which is common, I think, to the field, is the process is a sifting process, right? You're familiarizing yourself with a lot of information and trying to make some determinations about what to keep and what to discard. What are points of priority and importance, and what are things that maybe have to be left for another day or not evaluated. And the entirety of the process ends in this this OSM, this audit plan, evaluation plan. They're called several different things. Some set of research questions, objectives, some limitations on where they're going to be cut off, and some details on the methodologies on how you're going to do it. And that's your transition phase. So the entirety of this presentation is limited sort of that first funnel, but I think it's important to emphasize that the entirety of that set of work is designed to move you into the next phase effectively, to give you something that you can rely on and that will deliver the product that you've promised in and under budget and on time. Next slide, please. Thank you. So back to the risk assessment. I think one of the major risks, if you do this poorly, if your office is not, or if you're an analyst, if you're on a team and you run the risk of choosing a lower quality subject, right? The risk is if we haven't really prioritized well, then we're going to miss something. We're going to leave something out there that could have been better, and we're stuck with an inferior project once you move forward, and that's going to lead to your stakeholder dissatisfaction. Next slide, please. Thank you. So this is sourced to the text that I mentioned, the performance auditing book, and I don't know that I need to walk you through all those risk factors, but this is, as I think Emily mentioned, and Justin as well, there are degrees of formality, and I think your office can make choices, and your teams can make choices. How formal do you want to be in the risk assessment process, and how informal? I think it was Emily that mentioned part of it depended on size and complexity. I think that's probably spot on. The recommended steps here, though, are working you from some identification from that first silo of a ton of information to something that looks like a unit or set of units that you can and will be able to audit, a series of steps that will allow you to weight or prioritize those. And then I think Justin mentioned sometimes there are only a few objectives. I think that's right. I think you're going to be stuck almost on any project. You're going to have more interest than you have time. And so some objectives just have to be left for someone else another day. Anyway, those are steps you can apply. Next slide, please. Okay, so I think maybe an area that we haven't discussed too much yet, and that we can get into in some detail from one of the texts that I referenced, gets into that final second product, the audit plan that you are going to use as your technical roadmap. And I think one of the biggest risks here that has certainly been learned the hard way in my career here in Georgia is if you start off with underdeveloped or vague research questions, you're going to find yourself wandering in places that don't quite give you the product that you're hoping to deliver. You end up with squishy research or vague research. And what I think tends to happen if you don't iron out your objectives cleanly is that you end up doing it while you're budgeting time in your field work. So you still continue to try to refine your questions as you're actually doing work, and that's not ideal. So the next slide, if you don't mind. So this again is sourced back to the performance auditing text, and one of the things they'll recommend, they have several chapters on this, one of the things that they'll recommend that you consider when you're drafting your research questions are some criteria. And I found this especially useful for sharing with younger analysts, maybe first-time team leads who are charged with crafting their first set of research objectives. it allows them to kind of see tangibly component parts of their work in a question format. And again, it would be applied inside of some of the tools like the matrix that Justin and Emily spoke of. So the criteria for evaluating some of these, the quality of some of these research objective statements are, number one, is it answerable? So before you begin your work, if you're designing research questions, you want to make sure that you've crafted something in a way that's going to allow you to deliver a response. And the time that I spend here, it's usually yes, no, or to some extent, and it's almost always in that gray area to some extent. So your research question's phrased either as a literal question or as some type of to-determine statement that allows you to answer a research question. These second, or these 2, 3, and 4 are maybe the meat of some of the objective design that I want to talk about. So clarity in your internal, your audit subject, your performance aspects, and your finding elements, I think are things that might go implicit in discussion, but are maybe not as explicit sometimes. And the recommended practices that are put forth in the text that I mentioned include clarity in identifying your audit subject. You know, there's a hierarchy here. Emily, I think, mentioned that you know, a lot of times they're asked to go look at an agency, which is about as vague as you could run. But if that's the task, then you've got to kind of whittle your way down from there to find your programs, your functions, your tasks that you might want to include. And you can build that into your design inside of your research questions. Secondly, I think this was a point that Justin raised, which was component parts related to criteria. Or, as it's mentioned in the text that I've recommended to you, the performance aspects. Those are not just the what are we looking at, but how are we going to examine this. And for those of you in program evaluation, the logic model framework you should be somewhat familiar with, but in case you're not, you can design work that allows you to specify for your team how we're going to be evaluating this particular function or this program. Your 3 E's are your big standouts, obviously. Economy, which deals oftentimes with, you know, acquisition costs. Efficiencies and effectiveness are going to be related more to process. You know, are we processing things in a reasonable fashion? And effectiveness typically relating to mid or long-term or even short-term outcomes. But as I think was mentioned earlier, you can also have something that's totally different. You can design just strict compliance or fraud-related objectives. And I think building out the language inside of your research statements just makes that transparent. So you can use this as a bit of a checklist as you go through your drafting phase at the end of the planning process as you're developing your audit plan. I think I failed to mention, but Georgia is a Yellow Book office, and so you know we've been fed the finding elements for you know iteration after iteration of the Yellow Book, and those should be second nature to anybody in a Yellow Book office. But condition, criteria, cause, and effect. One of the things that I think is critical, and it certainly can burn up time if you're not careful here, spelling out inside of your research questions how far you intend to take a research objective. So for the uninitiated, the condition is largely just sort of what is, and I think that translates into what the authors of this text describe as a descriptive finding. So an example might be if the legislator wants to know how much does it cost to subsidize the school lunch program. That's a simple question, maybe not a simple answer, but it doesn't really get into evaluation and comparison. It's largely an exercise of trying to find out a number, right? You can build a criteria, and that's sort of a normative finding in the text, and that's largely going to be restricted to some statement of what is and maybe a comparison. In Georgia, it costs, you know, $500 a year for the child's subsidy. In Alabama, it costs $400. In Florida, it costs $350. And that can be the extent of the audit work if you choose to. oftentimes it's not. If you have some discrepancy in your performance, typically it's the next question is, well, how much and why? And so you can build, again, all of these typically into your primary research objective statement or your sub-objective statements. But I think the take-home message with all of this is you can build into your language of your research what you're going to look at, how you're going to look at it, and how far you're going to go to pursue the answers. Okay, next slide. So we could talk about planning all day, right? Everybody has come to the same conclusion that it can be a little chaotic and there's a lot of information you got to sift through. You got to think about a lot, and you've got to make some decisions about a lot. So we've talked about the risk assessments. We talked about designing objective statements. Some other things that I think occurred actually in some of the instruments that we've already talked about. Some things that are better to make transparent and explicit in the planning phase as opposed to implied. Your time period. How far back are you going to study? 2 years, 5 years? Is it some long-term research? Your population, staffing, data, and your plan test. Population, who's in, who's out. If you're going to be pulling samples, who are you interested in, and are you excluding anybody or anything? This was mentioned earlier, and I think it's an excellent piece of advice on staffing. There's always an opportunity when you're designing these projects to make parallel the research that has to be done and aligning it with both the skill set that the staff currently have and the skills and exposure that you hope the staff to have. So each project provides us an opportunity to push our staff a little bit further, expose them to things that they haven't done or haven't seen before, and I think that's something to consider when you're designing and staffing the project. A key piece, expertise required. Sometimes there's some very technical analyses that have to be done, actuarial analyses, for example, and those require a consideration by the team to either contract that or to shelve the project. So anybody who's contracted with outside experts knows that now you've got to build in some of their turnaround schedule. So that's certainly a piece to consider when you're designing your own budget. Are you going to have to go through some procurement process, and how's that going to affect your budget timeline? I think Justin mentioned this as well with respect to the data and the IT. A primary thing to consider when you're designing your research is whether or not we've got available data. There's always stuff that you wish you had and stuff that is actually available. And then lastly, if I could give you one last piece of advice going through this process, it never hurts and always helps. If you've got time, you've designed this nice methodology and all your tasks and how you're going to do it, have you tested it? It looks great on paper. Will it work in the field? So conduct a site visit, do a dummy run on your analyses, and make sure that before you put weeks and months in on something that it's going to deliver the product that you designed and hoped it would. All right, I think next and maybe final slide. Okay, so the previous presenters gave some instruments, a generic one that's floating around. It's a little harder to get to than maybe it should be. I don't think it's on their website. But if you're looking for options, GAO does have a design matrix. It's mentioned in that white paper I mentioned, and it has some of the same breakdown of component parts that those other items do. But if you're looking for a different variety, you can probably dig that up on the web. And that is designed to kind of give you your technical roadmap that I mentioned. Okay, that's about it. I think that's my last slide. Okay.
Emily, Justin, and Craig, thank you for your excellent presentations. We will now move to our question and answer period. If you haven't done so already, please type your questions in the chat box at the lower left of your screen. And if the question is for a specific speaker, if you'll enter their name, that will make it easier to know who you want to hear from. I will ask our panelists to address as many questions as possible. And as I'm waiting for a question to come in, I'll go ahead and ask. Emily, in Texas, when you get whole departments, how quickly do you get from whole department down to the specific area that you have time to examine?
Yeah, sure. So it depends on the size of the agency. If it's a small agency, it might be a matter of weeks. If it's a larger agency, we may spend the first month in sort of our overview, getting our feet on the ground and figuring out just what in the world this agency does and how they do it. So I would say a matter of weeks to no more than a month. I mean, but by the month end, we're probably pretty well to where we have to start scoping and figuring out what we're going to look at. Our longest reviews usually take about 7 months, so from start to finish. So hope that answers the question.
Yes, thank you. And it looks like folks are chiming in with questions, so keep them coming. First, we'll go with what are some common risk factors used in performing risk assessments? And I'm going to direct that to Justin first.
Hi. Common risk factors that we might consider would be, are there significant dollars going through the agency, the operations? Has it been a while since we've been there? Just the nature of what they do. Is there a public safety effect? Is there that kind of stuff I'm thinking about?
And Craig, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I would say that we're political by our associations. So sometimes relevancy in the public view, either the general public or the legislative or executive branch. We just completed a performance audit related to an HIV epidemic. So sometimes risk related to the project is driven by external factors, making it relevant.
Okay, great. And this question kind of builds on that last one. How much do you draw on the agency or program's knowledge of where potential risk factors are as you're doing the risk assessment? And I'll go back to Emily.
Sure. So we ask agencies to identify what they consider to be their biggest policy issues or problem areas, or things they want us to look at. They do that as part of a self-evaluation that they give to us. And so we certainly take that input in. It certainly does not mean that we always look at that. Sometimes we always hear they want more money, and we aren't appropriations, and so we can't do that. But sometimes agencies that really want to make the process really useful are really great about giving good ideas, and others less so. But we definitely ask and get their input.
Justin, what about you in Michigan?
I would say we would consider, what they think are potential risk factors. Sometimes what they think is a risky item really isn't. We'll entertain it a little bit. We'll look into it. Other times, perhaps, maybe it is a pretty significant risk factor, and we would, include that with our audit. But we would at least listen to them, I would say.
And Craig, what about you?
Yeah, I think I would echo both Emily and Justin. I think you solicit it, and then you sort of give it a test and see if it holds water and relevance. Sometimes the mere fact that you're given input from an entity and they're just completely off base might tell you as much as it would if they had a solid handle on their risk factors.
Okay, great. Craig, I think this next question is for you. Can you give an example of what fieldwork design testing would look like specifically?
Oh, sure. So So as I mentioned earlier, when you've designed your nice research plan, it's been mostly it might be some preliminary work that you've done, but you're moving out from your preliminary survey and planning phase, and you have well, at that point you still have hope that everything that you want to happen is going to happen exactly as you've planned. And so one way to test that is to get out and let's say your work is related to going to require some survey, some solicitation of opinion or information from a body. So you might select a portion, one or two participants out of that subpopulation to test drive or test run your survey. And before you roll it out to 500 recipients, go ahead and troubleshoot it, both for technical fluidity and also the results. Right? It's not always just about did it go in and did it come back, but did it deliver were the readers interpreting, the users interpreting the type of the questions the way we intended them to. So whatever your design is, whatever the meat of your product is going to be, if you can test drive it first, you'll save yourself some time and you'll sharpen up your product.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
We have time for one last question, so I'm going to ask one that I'm just curious about. You all were suggested to us as speakers from your offices because of your ability to handle the scoping and evaluation phase. I guess I should say the scoping and planning phase, which to me is really difficult. And I was just curious for our more junior evaluators on the line if you had any suggestions on what kind of skill sets you think make someone stronger at the planning and scoping phase and maybe areas they could focus on. I'll go to Emily first.
That's a good question, Kiernan. I guess skill sets. I think it's the ability to take a step back and see the big picture. For us, it's really easy to get into the weeds really quickly. And so I think that there is, and we tend to be detail-oriented, right, as auditors and evaluators. And so I think there's a skill set of being able to step back and see the forest for the trees. I don't know how you teach that skill set, but I would say that that's what makes it the scoping process easier, when you can step back and you can see how things are fitting together.
Okay. Justin?
I would say I need someone that can ask questions and get out of the office and ask more questions and go do observations and really get involved with the agency. I don't want someone to sit behind a computer all day trying to figure things out. They need to get out and they need to be face-to-face as much as possible. That really helps narrow down and scope out your audits. Okay.
And Craig?
Well, I just am sad I'm not going to be able to work with Emily and Justin. They're both spot on once again. Those are both great pieces of advice. If I were to add anything to, let's see. The team dynamic matters, right? So you've got to be able to trust your immediate supervisor to be able to give you good counsel. So don't be afraid as you survey the landscape. See the big picture, as Emily mentioned, get out in the field, get your ideas down, get them back to your team, and it's an iterative process. As you've seen from our funnels and our pictures, our cartoons with all the crazy chaos, there's a lot of sifting that has to be done, and sometimes just seasoning over and over and talking through those questions and those potential areas of research will help the younger staff. I would echo Justin's point. Sitting in a cube is not going to get the job done.
Okay. Well, again, thank you to our panelists, and thanks to all of you out there for joining us today. This webinar has been recorded and will be made available on the NCSL website within the week. The webinar is now concluded.